The morning air was cold and fresh when Ethan decided to take the girl into town. She needed food, medicine, and maybe help he couldn't give alone. But deep inside, he worried about how people would react when they saw her. She still refused to wear the shirt he had offered, keeping only the blanket wrapped around her thin frame. He tried again, holding out a simple dress he had found in an old storage box. She looked at it, then at him, and shook her head quickly. Ethan sighed but didn't push. If he forced her, she might run, and he didn't want that. The road to town was long and dusty, lined with tall pine trees. The girl walked beside him, barefoot, stepping lightly over rocks and roots like she had done it all her life. Every time a bird flew overhead or a squirrel darted across the path, her eyes followed it with sharp attention. She didn't talk, but she stayed close to him. Always just a step behind, Ethan noticed her fingers sometimes brush the edge of his coat as if making sure he was still there when they reached the town's edge. The quiet of the forest gave way to voices, carts, and the smell of cooked food. People were moving about, buying supplies, trading goods, talking in the streets. At first, no one noticed them, but then a man glanced their way, and his eyes froze on the girl. A whisper passed between him and the woman beside him, soon. Others turned to look. Ethan felt the weight of their stares. Some faces showed confusion, others something harsher. The girl noticed too, her steps slowing. Her grip on the blanket tightened as she pressed closer to him. A group of children stopped playing and pointed at her, one of them laughing. She flinched, her eyes darting like a trapped animal's. Ethan put a steady hand on her shoulder and kept walking. They reached the small general store. Inside, the air smelled of dust and dried herbs. The shopkeeper, a tall woman with sharp eyes, froze when she saw the girl. Ethan. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low but edged. "She's someone who needs help," Ethan replied firmly. The shopkeeper glanced at the girl again, her lips pressing into a thin line. Word spread quickly in a small town, and soon a few people had gathered. Outside the shop door, peering in while Ethan picked supplies, bread, fruit, a small bottle of antiseptic, the girl wandered to a shelf of fabric. Her fingers brushed over the colors, feeling the different textures for a brief moment. She smiled, a tiny, curious smile. But when she noticed two men watching her from the doorway, her smile faded, and she stepped back toward Ethan. One of the men muttered, "That's her." "The one from the hills?" The other shook his head. "Shouldn't be here." Ethan ignored them and paid for his supplies when he stepped outside. The small crowd that had formed made a path for him, but the air felt thick with judgment. A young man stepped forward, blocking their way. "What are you doing with it?" he demanded, his tone hard. Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's not an it. She's a person." The girl hid behind him, clutching his arm now. The young man scoffed. "Looks like trouble to me. We don't need her kind here." Before Ethan could respond, the girl let out a low, sharp hiss, a sound so animal-like it made the man step back. Her eyes blazed, and for a moment she looked like she would leap at him. Ethan turned and gently pulled her away. "She's with me," he said coldly. "That's all anyone needs to know," the man muttered under his breath but didn't follow. Still, the stares followed them all the way out of town. When they were far enough down the road, Ethan slowed his pace. The girl was still tense, her breathing quick. He glanced at her. "You did good back there," he said softly. She didn't answer. But her grip on his arms slowly loosened. In the distance, the forest waited, tall and quiet. Ethan wondered if bringing her to town had been a mistake. But part of him knew, sooner or later, she would have to face the world beyond the trees. And the world would have to face her that evening, back at the cabin. The girl sat by the fire, her blanket pulled around her shoulders. Ethan sat across from her, watching the flames, in the silence. He thought about the words the man in town had said. He had seen fear before, and the townspeople were afraid of her, but they didn't know her. Didn't know the way she smiled at colors, or the way she listened to every sound in the forest, and maybe they didn't want to know, outside. The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of something distant. It wasn't the cry of an animal, nor the rustle of branches. It was voices, faint and strange. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. Ethan saw it too, the way her body tensed like a bowstring. He didn't need words to understand whoever or whatever was looking. For her, had found their trail asterisk the next morning. The forest was covered in a soft mist. Ethan sat at the small wooden table, sipping his coffee. Across from him, the girl sat cross-legged on the floor, nibbling at a piece of bread she had wrapped the blanket tighter than usual, her silver hair spilling over her shoulders like a river of moonlight. Her bright eyes followed every move he made. If he lifted the cup, she watched. If he chewed, she chewed too, as if trying to copy his rhythm. It struck him that she was learning without him even teaching, so he decided it was time to try. He pointed at himself and said, "Ethan," slowly and clearly. She blinked, tilted her head, and whispered, "A." Then, the sound was rough but recognizable. Ethan smiled. "Good." Then he pointed at her. Waiting for a name, she hesitated, looking away. No answer came. It wasn't shyness. It felt like she didn't have a name, or maybe she couldn't remember. So Ethan tried something else. He began showing her objects and saying their names. "Cup," he said, lifting it. "Cup," she echoed softly. "Chair," he said, tapping the wooden chair beside him. "Chair," she repeated, her voice gaining confidence. It was slow work, but her eyes lit up each time she learned a new word. It made him think that under all the wildness, she was incredibly intelligent. Later, he gave her a pencil and a sheet of paper. At first, she held the pencil awkwardly, turning it over like she wasn't sure which end to use, but when he guided her hand to make a line, something seemed to click. She began to draw quickly, not random shapes, but strange flowing symbols that twisted like vines. Ethan leaned closer. "That's not human writing," he murmured. The symbols had a rhythm, almost like a language. When he pointed at them questioningly, she shook her head, as if saying it wasn't something she wanted to explain yet. The day passed quietly. She helped him stack firewood, and when a heavy log rolled toward her, she caught it with surprising strength. Ethan noticed the way she handled it, precise, practiced, like she had done hard work before. She wasn't fragile, no matter how she looked. Still, when he saw the small cuts and bruises on her arms, he wondered what kind of life had given them to her. That evening, the cabin glowed with firelight. Ethan sat carving a piece of wood. The girl sat on the rug, watching the flames. Every so often, she would glance at the small mirror on the wall. Studying her reflection with deep concentration, she would mimic expressions she had seen on his face. A raised eyebrow, a frown, a smile. Some of her attempts were clumsy, but each one made her more human in her own way. When she finally caught him looking, she gave him a shy smile. It was small, but it was real. He felt something warm in his chest, a bond forming between them, fragile but growing. But her peace didn't last long. A sudden howl echoed from deep in the forest, not a wolf's, not anything he recognized. Her body went stiff, her eyes darting to the door. Ethan set down the carving knife. "It's okay. You're safe here," he said, but she shook her head slowly. Her fingers curling into the blanket, she began speaking in her own language, fast, urgent. The words, sharp and strange, Ethan couldn't understand. But the fear in her tone was clear when she finally stopped. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen before. It wasn't just fear, it was warning. Whatever was out there, it wasn't far. And she knew it. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Ethan lay in bed, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire. The girl was on the floor as always, but she stayed awake for a long time, her eyes fixed on the window. He wondered what she saw in the darkness that he couldn't, and more than that, what had taught her to always be ready, always on guard. The next morning, the first thing she did was point at the door. Ethan thought she wanted to leave, maybe to go back into the forest. But when he stepped outside with her, she walked to a patch of dirt near the porch and knelt down with a stick. She began to draw again, not symbols this time, but shapes. It looked like trees, hills, and something else. At the center was a dark oval shape with sharp edges. She tapped it and then touched her chest. Ethan realized she was telling him where she had come from, but whatever that place was, the way her hand trembled said she didn't want to go back. He didn't press her. Instead, he took the stick and drew a small square, his cabin, and pointed between it and her. Safe, he said. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It was the first time she had accepted his words without doubt, and though he knew the forest still held dangers, at least now she knew she wasn't facing them alone. The sun was low over the green hills, turning the sky orange and gold. Ethan was walking the narrow trail back to his cabin, carrying a bag of tools on his shoulder. He had been working all day on repairing the water pump, and he was tired. The forest was quiet, except for the sound of leaves moving in the wind. But then, he saw something strange ahead. At first, he thought it was just a deer or some wild animal moving between the trees. But as he looked closer, his heart began to beat faster. A figure stepped out from behind a thick tree trunk. It was a girl, but not like any girl he had ever seen before. Her skin was pale, almost glowing in the fading light. Her hair was long and tangled, the color of silver under the sun. Her eyes were huge and bright, reflecting the light like a wild animal's, and she wore no clothes at all. Her body thin but strong, her movements silent and careful. She stood barefoot on the forest floor. Watching him without fear, Ethan froze, unsure what to do. He had heard rumors in the colony about a wild creature living in the mountains. Some said it was a ghost, others said it was a strange alien left behind after the war, but no one had ever proven it. Now he was standing only a few meters away from her. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Her gaze was sharp, but not hostile. She seemed more curious than afraid. Ethan slowly raised his hands to show he meant no harm. "Hey," he said gently, his voice low. She blinked, but gave no answer. The air between them was tense. Every sound in the forest seemed louder. A bird's cry echoed in the distance. Ethan took a small step forward. Suddenly, a loud snap broke the silence. A hunter's trap had sprung shut just a few feet away from her. It had been hidden under leaves, waiting for some unlucky animal. If she had taken one more step, it would have crushed her leg. She looked down at the trap, then at him. Her eyes widened slightly, like she understood what had just happened. Ethan quickly knelt down and pushed the trap aside. "Careful," he said, motioning for her to stay back. She didn't move away. Instead, she took a step closer to him. Her bare feet made no sound on the ground. Ethan noticed scars on her ankles, faint but clear. It made him wonder if she had been caught in traps before, or maybe chained. He stood up slowly, unsure if she would run. But she didn't run. She just kept looking at him when he turned to leave. Thinking she would vanish back into the trees, he heard the soft crunch of leaves behind him. She was following him. Every time he stopped, she stopped. Every time he looked back, she was there a few steps away. It was like she had decided to stay close to him for some reason. By the time Ethan reached the clearing near his cabin, the sun was almost gone. The forest shadows stretched long across the grass. He paused at the door, turning to see if she was still there. She was standing just at the edge of the clearing, looking uncertain. Ethan pointed toward the small wooden porch. "Come on," he said. She tilted her head again, then slowly walked forward. Her steps were light, almost graceful, like a wild animal that had never known fear of people. Inside, the cabin was warm from the fire he had left burning. The smell of wood and old books filled the air. She stepped inside carefully, her eyes scanning everything. The table, the chairs, the shelves. It was as if she had never been in a place like this before. Ethan went to the cupboard and took out a blanket. When he offered it to her, she just stared at it. Then she reached out and touched it, feeling the soft fabric between her fingers. She didn't wrap it around herself, she just held it like something strange and new. Ethan sat down in the chair by the fire. Watching her, she moved slowly around the room, touching the wood walls, the metal pans, the glass window. Every time she found something interesting. Her lips parted slightly in wonder. When she came to the mirror, she stopped. Her eyes widened as she looked at her own reflection. For a moment, she touched the glass, then looked over her shoulder at him. Ethan could see it in her face. She had no idea what a mirror was. That night, she didn't take the bed. Instead, she curled up on the floor near the fireplace, the blanket still in her hands. She closed her eyes like she was finally safe enough to sleep. Ethan lay in his bed, staring at the ceiling. He had no idea who she was, where she had come from, or why she lived like this. But he knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning, and something deep inside told him that bringing her here would change everything. Morning light spilled through the cabin window. Touching the wooden floor with a warm glow, Ethan woke to the faint sound of movement at first. He thought it was the wind rattling something outside. But then he saw her. The wild girl crouched near the table, staring at a jar of honey like it was some mysterious treasure. She had the blanket draped loosely around her shoulders, but most of her pale skin still showed. When she noticed he was awake, she froze, as if unsure if she was in trouble. "It's all right," Ethan said softly. Sitting up on the bed, he pointed at the jar. Then mimed eating. She looked from him to the jar, then slowly untwisted the lid when she dipped her finger inside and tasted it. Her eyes widened. A small sound escaped her lips, half surprise, half joy. Ethan smiled. It was like watching a child discover sweetness for the first time. He decided she needed more than just a spoonful of honey, so he went to the cupboard and took out bread and dried fruit. She sat on the floor as he placed the food before her. She sniffed it first, then took a cautious bite. Once she realized it was good, she ate quickly, almost desperately. It made him wonder how long she had gone without a real meal. After breakfast, Ethan thought about what to do next. She couldn't just live like this forever. No clothes, no language, no way to protect herself if the wrong people found her. But for now, all he could do was make her feel safe. He walked to the corner of the room and took a clean shirt from a shelf. Holding it up, he pointed to her, then to the shirt. She tilted her head in confusion. When he stepped closer and tried to gently put it over her head, she pulled back sharply, a flash of fear in her eyes. "It's okay," he said again, keeping his voice calm, but she shook her head, clutching the blanket tighter. Ethan realized this wasn't just shyness. Something about clothing frightened her. Maybe it was tied to her past. He didn't push. Instead, set the shirt on the table and stepped away. Her eyes followed his every movement like she was trying to figure out what kind of man he was. The day passed quietly. She stayed inside most of the time, wandering from one corner of the cabin to the other, touching objects as if she had to memorize their shapes. When she found his toolbox, she picked up a small screwdriver and examined it closely. Turning it in her fingers, Ethan showed her how it worked, unscrewing a loose hinge on the cupboard door. Her lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but close. He had a feeling she liked learning, even if she didn't have the words for it yet. That evening, Ethan stepped outside to bring in more firewood. The forest was quiet, but there was a strange feeling in the air, a weight as if unseen eyes were watching. When he turned, he caught sight of faint movement deep between the trees, a flash of something not human. It was gone as quickly as it appeared. He frowned and hurried back inside, locking the door. The girl was sitting by the fire, her silver hair glowing in the orange light. She looked at him, sensing his tension. He sat down across from her, trying to decide whether to tell her what he had seen. But before he could speak, she whispered something, her first real words in his language: forest. Bad. Her voice was rough, like she wasn't used to speaking. Ethan leaned forward. "What's bad?" he asked. She touched her chest, then pointed toward the dark trees outside the window. Her eyes were serious, almost fearful. It struck him then. Whatever had been watching wasn't just some random animal. It was connected to her. She had run from something, and it might still be looking for her. The fire popped and cracked between them, the only sound in the tense silence. Finally, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and curled up on the floor again. It was her safe spot. Right by the warmth, Ethan sat in his chair. Watching the flames, he knew he couldn't just send her away. Not now. Something about her made him feel responsible. But he also knew that whatever was out there in the forest wasn't going to stop. That night, sleep came slowly. Every sound outside the cabin seemed louder than usual. Once, he thought he heard faint footsteps in the grass. When he sat up and looked out the window, there was nothing but mist and shadows. But he didn't believe for a second that they were alone. In the quiet darkness, he made himself a promise. He would protect the strange girl no matter what. And if something out there wanted her back, it would have to go through him first. The wind carried a strange scent that morning. Ethan noticed it as soon as he stepped outside to fetch water from the well. It was faint, but sharp, like metal and smoke mixed together. The girl followed him to the porch, her bare feet silent. On the wood, the moment she stepped into the open air, her body went rigid, her nose twitched slightly, and her eyes narrowed toward the forest. Ethan didn't need words to know. She had caught the same scent, and it meant danger. He sat down the bucket and scanned the tree line. Nothing moved, but the forest felt different, to quiet. Not even the birds were singing. The girl stepped down from the porch, crouching low as she stared between the trees. She whispered something in her own language. Her voice was so soft he barely heard it. When he asked her what it meant, she struggled for words. Finally, she said, "They find," and pointed toward the forest. Ethan's stomach tightened. He didn't know who they were, but the fear in her eyes told him enough. He guided her back inside. Locking the door behind them, for hours, she stayed close to the window, watching. Every time a branch moved or a shadow shifted, her muscles tensed. It was like she was waiting for something she knew was coming. By afternoon, Ethan decided they couldn't just sit and wait. He gathered a few supplies, a knife, rope, and his old rifle, and told her they were going to check the outer edge of the forest. She followed without question. The path was narrow, winding between tall pines. Ethan kept his eyes moving, scanning for movement. At first, all they found were deer tracks and broken branches. But then, he spotted something half buried under leaves. A piece of black fabric, torn and stained with mud. It wasn't from any human clothing he knew. The girl froze when she saw it. She stepped back quickly, shaking her head. "They," she whispered again, her voice trembling before Ethan could respond. A sharp crack echoed through the trees, like a branch snapping under weight. Both of them turned at the same time. From the shadows, figures emerged. There were 3 of them, tall and thin, their skin dark and patterned with faint, glowing lines. They wore strange armor that clung to their bodies like a second skin. In their hands were long weapons that looked nothing like human rifles. The girl gasped, her blanket slipping from her shoulders. One of the strangers spoke in her language. the words quick and commanding. Her face twisted with anger, and she took a step back toward Ethan. The tallest of the three pointed at her and barked. Another order. Ethan didn't understand the language, but he understood the meaning. They wanted her to go with them. When she refused, one of them moved forward. Ethan stepped in front of her, gripping his rifle. Not happening. He said firmly. The three aliens stopped, their eyes narrowing at him. The air felt heavy. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt much longer. Then the tallest alien made a sharp hand gesture. The others stepped back, but their eyes stayed fixed on the girl. Ethan knew this wasn't over. They weren't retreating, just waiting for another chance. Slowly, they melted back into the shadows, their movements unnervingly silent. When? The forest swallowed them completely. Ethan exhaled the breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The girl's hands were shaking. She spoke quickly in her language, pointing to the forest, then to herself, then crossing her arms tightly. Ethan didn't understand all of it, but he knew one thing. They were hunters, and she was their prey. He didn't know why, but he could see the desperation in her eyes. She had escaped them once, but now they had found her trail again. They made their way back to the cabin before sunset. Ethan checked the windows, the doors, every corner of the place. The girl stayed close to him, barely letting him out of her sight. When night fell, she refused to sleep on the floor as usual. Instead, she sat with her back against the wall near the door. Clutching the blanket like a shield, her eyes stayed open long after Ethan lay down. Every sound outside the wind, the creak of wood, the snap of a twig made her head turn sharply. Ethan couldn't sleep either. He kept thinking about the way the aliens had looked at her. There had been no hesitation, no uncertainty. She belonged to them in their minds. And they weren't going to stop until they took her back. But if they thought he would let that happen, they were wrong. He didn't know why he cared so much about this strange girl from the wild, but he did. More than he had expected. As the night dragged on, the forest outside seemed to breathe with unseen life. Somewhere out there, the hunters were waiting, and Ethan knew the next time they came, it wouldn't be to talk. The night had been long and restless when morning came. Ethan found the girl still sitting near the door, her head leaning against the wall. Her eyes open, she hadn't slept at all. The fire had burned low, leaving only soft embers glowing in the hearth. Outside, the forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. Ethan made tea and handed her a cup. She held it in both hands but didn't drink right away. Her gaze was distant, fixed on something far beyond the cabin walls. Finally, she looked at him, her lips parted. And she spoke a single word in broken human speech. Tell. Ethan set his own cup down and nodded slowly. He sat across from her and waited. She hesitated, as if deciding how much she could trust him. Then she began speaking, first in her language. The words low and heavy, when she saw he didn't understand. She tried again in halting human words. She pointed to herself. Taken, she said. Then she crossed her wrists together as if bound. Ethan felt a knot form in his chest. She had been a prisoner, not in the human sense. Her description was different. Stranger. She used words like kept and owned. Then she tapped the blanket around her and shook her head sharply. They give. Cover, she said, searching for the right word. Then she touched her throat and made a gesture like pulling something tight. Ethan understood the clothes she had once worn were not for warmth or modesty. They had been chains in disguise. Her voice grew softer as she spoke. She had been one of many. Her people or others like her had been captured by the same ones they had seen in the forest. They were taken to a camp, a place hidden deep in the hills. She described high walls, made of black stone, lights that never went out, and voices that barked orders in the cold night air. She didn't know why they had taken her specifically, but she knew they valued her for something. Her eyes flicked toward the symbols she had once drawn for him. When he pointed at them now, she nodded slowly. It was her language, and it was rare. Not many of her kind knew it anymore. And the ones who did were important. Ethan realized they hadn't just been after her as property. They had been after knowledge. The kind she carried in her mind, and maybe the kind that could be dangerous in the wrong hands. She told him how she had escaped. One night, during a storm, the camp's gates had opened for a supply run. She had slipped into the shadows and fled into the mountains. For days she had lived on roots and berries, hiding in caves, drinking from streams. When the hunters searched for her, she hid high in the trees, not daring to move. That was how she had survived until the day Ethan saw her in the forest. Her voice shook when she described the punishment for those who tried to run. She made a sharp snapping motion with her hands. And Ethan didn't need more explanation. The ones who were caught never walked again. He realized how close she had come to that fate. And how dangerous it would be if they caught her now. When she finished speaking, she fell silent. Her breathing was steady, but her eyes were tired. It was clear she hadn't told the story to anyone before. Ethan felt a deep weight settle on him. He had known she was running from something, but now he knew exactly what, and it wasn't going to stop. He leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "You're safe here," he said firmly. She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the truth in his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. But he could see the doubt still there. She knew safety was temporary. The hunters would come again. And next time, they might not leave without her. That night, Ethan made a plan. If they came, he wouldn't wait for them to surround the cabin. He would take the fight to them. The girl seemed to sense his resolve when he began checking the rifle and sharpening the knife. She moved to his side and picked up the rope. Her hands were steady, her eyes determined. She wasn't just going to hide, she was going to fight too. For the first time since she had come into his life, Ethan saw her not as a frightened girl from the wild, but as someone who had survived more than most people ever would. And he knew that if they stood together, the hunters were in for a fight they wouldn't forget. Outside, the wind howled against the cabin walls. In the darkness beyond the trees, somewhere far off, a faint light flickered. It wasn't the moon. It was the sign of someone moving through the forest. And Ethan knew their time was running out. The forest was dark long before the sun had fully set. Clouds hung heavy above the hills, hiding the stars. Ethan stood at the window, his rifle in hand, watching the tree line. The girl sat beside the door, rope coiled neatly in her lap. A small knife hidden under the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. Both of them knew tonight was the night the hunters would come. The hours dragged, the fire burned low, and the cabin filled with the sound of the wind whispering through the cracks. Then, without warning, the night fell silent. Even the wind stopped. Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. The girl rose to her feet, her eyes sharp and alert. She pointed toward the forest, toward 3 faint lights moving slowly between the trees. The hunters, they came like shadows, their tall forms gliding between the trunks, weapons glinting in the dim light. Ethan waited until they were close enough to see the cold glow in their eyes. Then he opened the door and stepped outside. The girl right behind him, the lead hunter, spoke in her language, a short, sharp command. The girl didn't flinch. She replied with a single word, one Ethan didn't understand, but the tone was pure defiance. The hunter moved forward, but Ethan raised his rifle, not one more step. He said, his voice steady. The hunter froze, but only for a moment. Then, as if deciding he wasn't a real threat, they rushed forward. Ethan fired, the shot cracking through the night. The lead hunter staggered back, not dead, but wounded. The other 2 spread out, trying to flank him. The girl moved like lightning, circling behind one of them. She threw the rope around his arm and pulled hard, twisting until his weapon dropped into the dirt. The hunter snarled in pain, but she was already gone. Darting toward the shadows before he could grab her, Ethan reloaded quickly, firing again. Forcing the second hunter to dive for cover, the fight wasn't neat or clean. It was wild, fast, and dangerous. One of the hunters lunged toward the girl, catching the edge of her blanket. For a moment, Ethan's heart stopped. But she spun, slashing with the small knife, cutting deep into the alien's arm. He roared in pain and stumbled back. She didn't waste a second. She kicked his leg out from under him and sent him crashing to the ground. The blanket fell away, and for the first time, Ethan saw her fighting without any sign of fear. The lead hunter, still wounded, tried to rally the others, but Ethan had moved closer, using the trees for cover. When the hunter aimed his weapon, Ethan fired one. Last time, sending him crashing into the dirt. The forest fell silent, except for the heavy sound of breathing. The girl stood beside him now, her hair wild, her chest rising and falling quickly. She looked at the fallen hunters, then at Ethan. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she reached out and took his hand. It was the first time she had ever done it willingly, without hesitation. They didn't wait for the hunters to recover. They tied them with a rope, taking their weapons and tossing them deep into the river by the time the first light of dawn touched the hills. The hunters were gone, either fled or carried away by their own people. Ethan and the girl stood at the edge of the forest. Watching the mist rise, the air felt lighter, freer, for the first time since she had appeared in his life. There was no shadow waiting in the trees. That afternoon, Ethan took her into town again, not to hide her, but to let her walk beside him without fear. This time, when people stared, she didn't shrink back. She met their eyes, calm and steady. Some turned away, but others seemed curious, even cautious. The shopkeeper who had once questioned her gave a small nod when they entered. It wasn't full acceptance, but it was a start. After they bought supplies, Ethan led her to a small clothing shop. She hesitated at the door, looking at him like she wasn't sure why they were there. He smiled. "Let's get you something that's yours." Inside, she touched the fabrics carefully. Feeling the textures between her fingers, she tried on a simple dress, soft light, a pale blue that brought out the silver in her hair. When she looked in the mirror, she froze. Then, slowly, a shy smile spread across her face. Ethan paid for the dress without a second thought. When they stepped outside, she walked with her head higher, the blanket folded under her arm. It wasn't just clothing, it was a choice, something she had never been allowed before. And now, it was hers. That evening, back at the cabin, she sat by the fire in her new clothes, her eyes calm. Ethan poured tea for both of them. When he set the cup in front of her, she looked at him and spoke softly. "Home," she said. He nodded, a small smile on his face. Yes. Home, outside, the forest stretched wide and endless. But, for the first time, neither of them feared what might be hiding there. The hunters were gone, and the girl was free. And whatever came next, they would face it together.